Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today, let's go to Denmark. I was just talking to the fellow about Denmark, and I've only been through it on the train, so I really don't know the country, but I have a very good impression of it. And I have a really good impression of him, too, because this really interesting article that was published in, I guess, Nature magazine. You can't do better than that. His name is Chad Baum, and he's an assistant professor in business development and technology. And he's with the Aarhus University Interdisciplinary Center for Climate Change. The article was an effort to assess public opinion globally about geoengineering, if you don't mind the expression. It's extremely important to not only find out, but if possible, to improve the level of discourse publicly about various technological solutions to climate change or efforts to fix climate change. And you have done a global study of it. So why don't you give me the whole rundown?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me. So this was part of a project called GENI, stands for Geoengineering and Negative Emissions in Europe. So it's a European-based project funded by the European Research Council. And I have some excellent colleagues, Benjamin Sovacool, Livia Fritz, and Sean Lowe. Mm-hmm. And we were very fortunate that when we got funding for this, one of the main deliverables that we had is to do a set of surveys and focus groups in 30 countries around the world. So we talked to more than 1,000 people in each of these countries, and I can talk about where those.
You actually talked?
No, sorry. We contracted surveys because what tends to happen is, we did some focus groups as well that we had some moderators too. But so 30,284 people in total across 30 countries. And so a lot of those were in Europe, given where the project's based. So that's already taking one step back. But one of the big problems when it comes to talking about public perceptions of carbon removal, solar geoengineering, is that it tends to be the case that they focused only on 3 countries, the United Kingdom, Germany, and the United States. So we had looked at this and found that all the survey work, about 65% of the times they looked at one of those countries. And before our study, there had never been any research looking at South America. There's maybe once or twice that they would engage with Africa, a little bit in Asia. So we wanted to rectify this. And so ours was the first time that every continent across the world had at least one representative, and we tried to have at least 3 in each, actually. And so to have this broad
representative would be a group or not just an individual?
No, a country. So again, so for instance, we had Chile, Brazil, and Argentina. So those 3 countries, 1,000 people in each. Oh, sorry, Chile, Brazil, and Dominican Republic. Mm-hmm. Argentina was a separate one. In Africa, we had Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. Asia, of course, China, India, Singapore. So that was another thing, is we really wanted to have the large countries, of course, but also small island developing states, given their importance for this discussion. And then to kind of look at what are the similarities and differences between how the representative publics in each of these countries kind of felt about these technologies.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Okay. And now these are sampled, some kind of stratified random sampling. Is that right?
Yeah, they're representative in terms of age, gender, whether they live in an urban or rural environment. We have broad sampling in terms of education and income, and then also in terms of the region of the country which the people come from.
So you can make general statements about things like the difference between rural and urban public opinion and so on, huh?
We can do our best within reason. Of course, it depends on, we access the publics through the internet. So if there's, disparities in terms of internet access, mm-hmm. then that is a limitation. Mm-hmm. And also additionally with, older individuals, sometimes that can be an issue, but we do try to address that as much as possible. But yeah, there are limitations.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of response rate do you get when you send a questionnaire out just as an email, or what do you do?
So for this one, we work with a professional firm that has these panels that people are a part of, and they then send out the invitation to the all of the people that are eligible to take part within the panel.
Mhm.
And then some people will be screened out. For instance, if they're too young, so if they're younger than 17 or so, then they'll be screened out. And then also we do have, we let them know for privacy and security reasons that, the types of questions we'll ask. And if they're not willing to take part, they'll also be screened out. But, there's all these different quality checks and other aspects that go into it.
Mhm. Okay, well, you sound like a good sociologist. That's my background. Well, now let's get down to the heart of the matter. What'd you find out?
Well, a good number of things. And I should mention, I took up the survey part, but my colleagues also looked at focus groups, and we had 44 focus groups in 22 countries. So, the surveys were quantitatively representatively rich, whereas we kind of dug into more specific elements in a more in-depth qualitative fashion from the focus groups. So the reason we decided to outsource all of them to moderators is the surveys were done in 30 countries in 19 languages around the world. No, we're not able to speak Arabic, Japanese, Chinese, everything else. So for that reason, it was easier for quality control to have the moderators that were doing these focus groups all trained and, by one specific person at the firm. One of the big discussion points often when it comes to solar geoengineering or to carbon removal is this idea that publics in general are rejecting of these technologies. We did not find that to be the case. Now, there were differences. So we randomly assigned people to read about one of three types of technologies. Ones that were more ecosystems-based carbon removal technologies, afforestation, soil carbon sequestration, for instance. Then there were more novel carbon removal technologies, direct air capture is one, another such as enhanced rock weathering. And then the third group was solar geoengineering, so stratospheric aerosol injection, marine cloud brightening, some of these others. Mm-hmm. It was the case that in general, all the publics around the world were more supportive of the ecosystems-based CDR. So everybody loves trees, is what they often say. Then the next category that was more supported tended to be the more novel CDR, but there were some sort of overlap here. And then solar geoengineering, those three options were the least supported. But if you look in relation to the scales, there were still tendencies of more support rather than rejection. So it's not the case that in general people are just completely negative about these technologies. The other big thing is...
even this solar.
Yeah, it was still more slightly above the midpoint. So when we asked them on a scale of 1 to 5, do they strongly reject? That's 1. Somewhat reject 2, neither reject, no support 3, and then up to strongly support. It was always at least above 3.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and did you do a specific ones, particular technologies, like the difference between spraying sulfur into the stratosphere versus whitening the clouds with solar with marine cloud brightening? Did you make those distinctions or not?
We did. So for each of those technologies, there was a text of about 100 to 125 words, accompanied by a sort of illustrative graphic just to keep it straight. And we then, also asked about 3 different types of support, for instance. Did they support research and lab activities? Did they support small-scale field trials? Or did they support broad deployment of the technology? Mm-hmm. There tended to be minimal differences depending on the type of technology. So you do see some. For instance, space-based geoengineering was the third we asked about in that category. And with some exceptions, space-based geoengineering tended to be not so well preferred as the others, although some groups tended to kind of find it more intriguing. But this idea of like a more regional versus global, distinction didn't really hold in this case.
The differences are not great, though? Is that what you're saying overall? The support for the most daring and potentially risky technology, how different would be the level of support for that compared to, say, I would also guess that forestry would be something almost everybody would go for.
Uh, yeah. So there's two very important things to say, kind of at the outset here, and one is that there are still broad levels of unfamiliarity for these
Yes.
technologies.
Yes.
Afforestation, reforestation excluded, but for the others, it tended to be 10, 15, no more than 20% of people said that they were, relatively familiar with it. So we find a kind of terra incognita when it comes to the publics at this point.
Mm.
And given that unfamiliarity, and given that, for the survey exercise, there wasn't a ton of complexity in terms of how these would be deployed, it's also the case that when discussions eventually occur in the real world about how to deploy these different technologies, in what way and under what guises, or by which actors, it very well could take on a different tenor. So that needs to be said outright, and you probably need a much more nuanced, in-depth approach to kind of dig into things such as how marine cloud brightening could be used in certain parts of the world versus how stratospheric aerosol injection might be deployed.
Yeah. Well, just overall, how much difference did it make whether they say they were familiar with the technology or not? And in which direction did their opinions vary?
So that wasn't one of the variables that we found to be the most important, but generally in the literature, those that say they're more familiar with, solar geoengineering or more novel forms of carbon removal tend to be more supportive. Now, you have to get into the whole question here of, are they saying they're more supportive because they're familiar? Have they researched it because of their underlying interests? Or, do they then claim to be familiar because they're supportive of these things? It's hard to answer those questions, but it's something to be looked at further. That because we had 10 countries from the so-called global south, and, depending how you look at it, 19 or 20 from the global north, we could look at a broad level whether or not people from the global north versus global south were more supportive of these technologies. There's a big debate that's been going on, calling some of these, a rich man's solution that is used in a kind of colonial fashion in countries or continents such as Africa. We, however, found, given the caveats I mentioned earlier, that those in the global south were more supportive of technologies such as SRM and carbon removal. And it wasn't a small difference either. So, you can look into some of these differences, and we've tried to explain as well what might be some solutions, but it's a fairly strong finding. It's a strong finding with the caveats I mentioned. But I will say, I'm now aware of 4 or 5 other studies, smaller in scale than our own, that have allowed for a comparison between global north and global south publics, and all of them find the same thing. So I always, invite into the discussion that we can't use the trope anymore of saying global south is against this.
Mhm.
There may be certain elements in the global south, but that blanket statement can't hold based on the research we've seen.
Mhm. Well, when you ask people how bad they think it's going to be, how serious the problem is there a difference between North and South in the assessment of risk?
So those in the global south are, they have experienced overall natural disasters to a much higher degree. They perceive harm from climate change to a much higher degree in the future, that they'll be impacted. They're also more worried about it. We had a recent paper that just came out in risk analysis that dug into this. And what was interesting is that while worry about climate change is high, there's also a greater degree of hope about climate change. So we had these questions where we asked, how do you feel these different emotions? And we asked about hope. And those in the global south tended to also be more hopeful about climate change, specifically in countries such as Nigeria, Kenya, and Dominican Republic. So I think that's a whole separate question, but we need to also begin to better understand what hope related to climate change and those sorts of changes and difficulties will mean in the future, because looking at it from a Western lens, I don't think we understand that well, what hope can mean in different areas at the moment.
Well, the first question would be, would it be because they expect that somebody's going to come along and save them with geoengineering? I mean, if they think that's what it is going to work, and let's hope they're right, if that's the view, that there's hope that somebody will pull a rabbit out of the hat at the last minute.
Yeah, I mean, that gets into a very difficult discussion about the degree to which thinking about something like solar geoengineering or these solutions might encourage people to, invest less in mitigation or to devote less effort there.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't necessarily see that relationship so directly. It is the case that those in the global south we had a question about, do you think science and technology will be a solution to climate change? Mm-hmm. And that was an important factor in two ways. One, those in the global south tended to believe that more strongly, we found. But it was also the case that those people in general that held such views were more likely to be supportive of carbon removal and solar geoengineering. And that was one of the strongest variables we found. So that is important to acknowledge. But there's a more interesting interplay of factors going on there when we try to dig into what's going on in terms of hope. Another one that's very important when it comes to support for solar geoengineering in particular is that there's something about belonging to a younger population. So those people in the sample who were from younger countries in terms of the median age tended to be more supportive of solar geoengineering. This was an effect we looked at, and you can't, point to this as any strict thing, but it's something that emerged from it. And so the question is here, do they perceive more opportunities for the future, coming from societies that are relatively gerontocratic when it comes to our governments? Is it the fact that maybe they perceive more opportunities here for the future? Or, in general, there's something going on that we don't understand that requires a more, let's say, rich sociological lens?
Okay, your first response to my question about hope, or my guess about the interpretation, seemed to point toward the moral hazard argument, as if that answer would be relevant to assessing how important the moral hazard question is, or explain how much that is a real consideration. I hadn't even thought of the connection, but is there any way in which any of your questions more definitively impact on the question of whether or not the argument, we should explain what that is. Some people who, in fact, I would say the majority of people who oppose geoengineering do so on the basis of the argument that this will give, that if it works, it will give an excuse, or even if it doesn't work, even attempting it will detract from our commitment to reduce climate change by reducing emissions of greenhouse gas, because it will give people the illusion that they are going to be fine because somebody will come and take the carbon out of the atmosphere mechanically or in some other way, so that they don't have to make any sacrifices. So this will discourage people from being enthusiastic about carbon emission reduction. I think that's the basic argument. It also often is applied to the notion of giving an excuse to the fossil fuel industry that they don't have to do anything because we can just clean up the mess that they keep on making. So what I wanted to ask is whether or not your questionnaire would have given an answer to that question, whether people believe in the or are susceptible to the argument that the moral hazard claim puts forward.
Yeah, it's a very important and quite complicated question, and I can maybe offer an answer related to the survey and then have a more general comment. But one thing that's very interesting in the survey is we had questions about support. We also had a more detailed question about different risks and benefits related to these technologies. One thing to note is kind of similar to support. For instance, those in the global south were more positive about the benefits in general. When it came to the risks, and we looked at 4 different types of risks, it's worth kind of highlighting these. So one was that'd be a threat to humans and nature. There was another one about whether it was, safe and secure. There was also whether there would be an unequal distribution of risks and benefits between rich and poor countries. And then there was a 4th one that was specifically that it would reduce the motivation to reduce emissions. What's interesting is, as mentioned, the people in the global south in general, we found to be statistically more supportive of the technologies, more positive about the benefits, but their profile of risks different. So they believed specifically for SRM and for certain forms of novel carbon removal that this was a bigger problem than those in the global north. So it was the case they were worried about moral hazard. They were also worried about an unequal distribution of risks and benefits. So they held those concerns while at the same time being positive about the benefits and being supportive. Mm-hmm. So it's never the case that these are naive publics. They have concerns, and oftentimes, they'll have a not so positive perception of risks and benefits while still being supportive. So my sort of working hypothesis right now is they, given their concerns about climate change, want to see these technologies further developed. They want to see governance, that developed, but they haven't seen problems that are enough to cause them to not be supportive for the time being.
Mm-hmm. I think that's smart, personally. I guess you try not to have an opinion until later. Okay.
So we have a separate study that was much smaller. So after Make Sunsets had their unauthorized trial in Mexico, we put out a study
where we focused. Describe that, if you will.
Yeah, I have to be careful because sometimes my opinions on this bleed through a bit more. But so basically, there were 2 Silicon Valley tech bros who kind of came into the space of SRM and decided that they were going to try to be provocative and push things forward, move fast and break things. And so one of them even had come to the space after giving up on his previous idea about taking shipping containers and turning them into cheap housing solutions in order to solve the homeless problem around San Francisco. And so they decided to order some of the relevant gas online for sulfur dioxide, and then drive down in a van to Mexico, fill up some balloons and with stuff that they bought online, and to try to do some unauthorized trials of actually doing stratospheric aerosol injection, and then sell cooling credits that you can still buy online. I've been offered to do that a few times at this point. Haven't taken them up on the offer yet. But so they did this all in a very sort of, DIY, do-it-yourself approach. It came to the attention of the Mexican government, who then said, we have not authorized this, and we do not want any of this done on our territory until there is an international governance approach in place. Basically saying they didn't want to be the first in the world. Make Sunsets then moved up to the US, where they were working in Nevada, and they were told to have a pause for a second because it wasn't clear whether they had approval from the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority. So I think they're now continuing to release, some balloons up there as well. So after this happened, it captured some big public attention. I believe it first was announced through a very, important article from the journalist James Temple. This was around Christmas of 2023, if I remember. So, And so we then wanted to quickly put a survey together that looked at Mexico, because Mexico was where it was done, as well as the U.S. and the United Kingdom. And the basic idea here was just to ask, if stratospheric aerosol injection is being done in the United Kingdom versus Mexico, how does that change support? If it's done by a university versus by a Silicon Valley startup, how does that change support? And if it's done by for small scale testing purposes versus for big commercialization. The unfortunate, or the humbling takeaway was that there weren't a lot of immediate important findings. That for the time being, people weren't so worried about these differences. But what was very strange and counterintuitive is we found that those in Mexico were more supportive if it were done in Mexico than if it were done in the United Kingdom. They wanted it to be done on their local territory while also being very supportive of having national level governance here going on. So again, this idea of there needing to be a big ban, we didn't find, but there was some desire that people wanted to have a say in what was going on and wanted to kind of explore this. I will note as well, and this gets back to your earlier question about moral hazard, is in that study, we actually had two different items about moral hazard. One, whether it would have a negative effect, and then another, kind of in a more positive direction. And we actually found both to be true, because there's a lot of discussions of whether this will undercut emissions at the individual level, which there's not a lot of support for. In fact, the literature finds, sometimes it has a positive effect, sometimes negative. But then there's also the political question. Will this cause...
hold on. I didn't know that there was a way of even measuring the effect. How are you looking at that?
Yeah, so the idea is that sometimes they'll do... So some colleagues of mine, Christina Merrick and others, there's a small but important literature here, about 6 or 7 in total. And what they'll find, for instance, is if they introduce people to SRM, give some information, they will then see how that affects certain behaviors. So for instance, are they more or less likely to buy a carbon offset? Are they more or less likely to engage in some sort of mitigation behavior? Mm-hmm. And so they've done something like that. There's even another study in Journal of Environmental Psychology that does 6 or 7 different types of kind of activities related to moral hazard. That's really quite involved. And the broad takeaway here is sometimes in this literature on what could be called individual moral hazard, there are positive effects. So basically, the way the logic runs is if they're informed about solar geoengineering, they then say, I didn't realize the problem is that bad. And then they take climate change more seriously. Mm-hmm. And then so it actually has a positive effect on wanting to, mitigate or reduce emissions. Some find that it has no effect, and some find that, so in line with what's typically argued, that it in fact, is adverse to reducing emissions.
Here's what I would have imagined, just from the people I know, because I have a lot of friends who are interested in promoting the various technological answers. My guess is that my friends would not be concerned about flying or turning off the lights, in rooms that are not using it, or riding a bicycle rather than driving the car. Or I don't think, my impression is that the people who believe that that geoengineering is necessary and we should do it now are people who believe that it's really hopeless to try to bring emissions down enough to really make a difference. So that'd be all fine and good in another world, but this is the real world, and we better do something more drastic. That's what I would think about the people I know, and the people that I know who do things like, do not go, they won't fly, for example. I mean, those are people who wear old clothes because they don't want to, they don't believe that the economy should be allowed to grow. We should all live simpler and raise our own food and not import lemons from California, because that's transportation is too much and things like that, which I don't personally pay attention to that, but that's my impression. And I'm not sure that what you said confirms or denies that. Yeah, that my guess.
Yeah, I mean, researchers sometimes are a different breed, but it has been fascinating, having been in this space for a bit more than 4 years now, that the ones that are very pessimist about the future, and our ability to reduce emissions tend to be more receptive to the idea of considering these technologies. But it doesn't always map out one to one. But I will say so Wim Carton and other colleagues had a really interesting paper that talked about different types of moral hazard. So what we've talked about so far is how this will affect individual citizens. But a lot of people say the bigger question isn't what they'll do, but how politicians do or do not use this to say we shouldn't reduce emissions. So you mentioned fossil fuel companies before, and some people are concerned when they hear about, certain oil and petroleum companies buying direct air capture companies. And the idea is this moral license here not a question of individual citizens, but politicians then saying we don't have to do anything because of that? And that's a question that hasn't received really much attention in the literature, because I guess then you'd have to actually sample politicians, which is not so easy as kind of talking to individual citizens.
Okay. So you don't have an answer on that. Okay.
I wish. We're looking into maybe doing some expert interviews with policymakers, but it's a harder question. I will say there was a paper from, I want to say 6 years ago now, that talked to climate negotiators and looked at how, like, their perceptions of SRM and their views on climate change. So that is one interesting one.
What did you find?
Well, that wasn't us. If I remember, yeah. Oh, I'd have to go back and look at it. I haven't looked at that in a few months, so I don't want to misquote it right here.
Yeah, okay. My impression is that politicians are just about neck and neck with fossil fuel owners in their general opposition to geoengineering. That they're the most reluctant of any, and really fear that some terrible thing is going to happen. But that's just guess, from where I sit. So you're the guy who knows the answers.
Oh, I would defer. I have some really great colleagues that look at the policy discussions. It is becoming more open, or at least discussed. So under Biden, the Office of Science and Technology Policy started to have it as part of their discussion, which then led the EU to mention it for the first time in a national security document. We were then part of a big evidence review report that was delivered to the European Commission on solar radiation modification. And it's now being discussed a bit more openly. And, the EU said that they didn't want to have, they wanted to have a moratorium on this for at least 5 years. But I read that document as being a bit more, willing to discuss this openly and transparently. And then, of course, in the last year, the United Kingdom, through their ARIA program, is starting to fund field trials, which has, lit a fire under some corners of the academic community. But yeah, so there's more discussion going on here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that Sir David King, who I guess is no longer, but was the head honcho for climate change and officially recognized as the scientist who's the most authoritative about climate change in the UK, of course, is very pro geoengineering, or at least some of it. And also that the whole Cambridge University outfit seems to have been, in fact, they a guy named Hugh Hunt, I believe, has been doing real research in Canada on freezing the ice, pouring water on top of the ice and letting it thicken the ice so that it stays solid throughout the summer, or is more likely to not all melt. So that apparently was going on well before the UK decision to fund anything systematically. He was also involved with something where they were sprinkling rice husks on the water in the Red Sea or someplace, and then there was a storm which ruined the whole experiment. But it was a geoengineering experiment. So there has been real research of some empirical kind in UK for some time now. And I don't know whether that's very well known, even in UK. What do you think?
No, in fact, the one paper that we did looking at Mexico, US, and UK, which I ended up calling like diamonds in the sky, just because of the fact that diamond dust can be one of the elements used, not necessarily the most inexpensive for stratospheric aerosol injection, but people didn't necessarily know it, but there has been a trial of stratospheric aerosol injection in the UK outside of Milton Keynes that was done by a project that called itself Satan. So you can look at whether that was trying to be provocative or not. So that has been done. And of course, with ARIA, Hugh Hunt, I believe, is he's a part of one of the projects that has gotten funded. So it's something being done more and more. What's also quite interesting is, the different views in, let's say, the Arctic or Finland as well. So you mentioned Cambridge. They just had their conference, which they call Arctic Repair, which a lot of people were at in, I believe, end of May. And so after the Scopex trial was canceled because of the indigenous Sami people pushing back, among others, it kind of became understood that Scandinavia, the Arctic, was against it. But then there's been some younger groups. Operatio Artis is one of sort of younger climate activist, climate interested people in Finland and other places that were trying to push through this. And so I know, for instance, they're having a big meeting in a couple months. And as you mentioned, David King and others, one of the big names is James Hansen, who's now come out as being on board with solar geoengineering and pushing for it. I believe he's going to be a keynote there, and some others. So you also see this sort of cleave or divide when it comes within the climate community with some big names. On the other side, there's some big names also against it as well. So it is something that's attracting more debate.
I think the people at Potsdam are the most negative, right?
I mean, on the Genie project, we have colleagues at PIC, at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's all the case. I mean, even within institutes, people can differ. So
okay.
I will say, though, that one thing that everyone agrees on, including those in the solar geoengineering community, is we would all, I say if you gave me a magic wand, I wouldn't wave the magic wand and say more money for carbon removal or solar geoengineering. I'd wave the wand and say, let's have climate emissions reduction. So, emissions reductions of greenhouse gases. And I'd say that's universally the case. Nobody's sitting here wanting to be looking at these technologies for their own sake. It's to different extents a last resort, or something that we'd like to see be done so we have enough information to make a decision should we need these technologies.
Okay, I have a friend, Gwen Dyer, who has a book on it, and we share pretty much the same view, which is you can talk and talk and talk about emission reduction and how wonderful it would be, but it's not happening, or at least it's all that's happened is they've decreased the rate of increase. We continue to put out to increase the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, but the best we can claim is that the rate of increase has slowed. Well, that's 40, 50 years of effort, and so it just ain't going to happen. So if it ain't going to happen, then what else have you got? That's my point of view. Rural versus urban. Tell me about that.
We had a study into that about last year. I'm trying to remember. So it tended to depend on the technology. As far as I remember, for urban populations in the global south, they tended to be the most positive overall. So but it wasn't necessarily the case that you could say rural people are completely against the technologies, because it's kind of a mix and it depends on the specific technology. But you did see this, that urban people, as well as I think another one was whether they belonged to an indigenous group or minority, that we found also there tended to be some positive support when it came to solar geoengineering.
Oh, okay. Now tell me more about the indigenous people, because I mean, you mentioned the Sami, and that is a little confusing because, well, okay, just see, is there an overall answer to the question, are indigenous people more positive or less? Is there any real answer to that?
Or no. I mean, we of course found that in our study, we asked, do you perceive yourself as belonging to an indigenous group or ethnic minority?
Mm-hmm.
But what needs to be understood is, for instance, first of all, we asked those questions together. If I would do it again, I would separate them. In fact, we are in the current study separating whether they belong to an ethnic minority or an indigenous group. But also, the way the study worked, the survey, we had to ask this all together. But being in, an ethnic minority in, for instance, Estonia, the ethnic minority there are the Russians. But if you go 100 kilometers over the border in Russia, they're not an ethnic minority. So that's a very different thing than to be, an indigenous group in America or Canada. So this collapses a lot of very important distinctions. So I tend to be a bit cautious with this. And not to mention with the Sami, they were very vocal and protective for very clear and, self-evident reasons of needing to be consulted, which they say they were not sufficiently. But then there are also people as part of the Sami.
Sorry, that was something David Keith did when he was at Harvard? Was that experiment his? I thought he was behind it.
It was. There's the extent to which he wasn't necessarily the one leading it at that point anymore. And it's a very complicated history of what went on there that, I've talked to people on both sides of it about, and it's almost like a Rashomon situation about what did or did not happen there, or where the blame is to lie. So it's one of these complicated tellings. But I think one thing, and the Scopex Advisory Committee with Sakina Jinnah among others, then wrote up a very interesting discussion, and what are some tales to take away from this. And I think that's very important reading for this community and for future work, that basically needing in a proactive, thoughtful way to engage with potentially affected communities early on, including doing sort of co-production of knowledge and not just having science first approaches.
Okay, well, my recollection was that it was mostly, as I heard it was mostly the seniors, the elders, or the political leaders of the Sami population who objected because they had not been consulted, but that young Sami people are very supportive of geoengineering and are part of this outfit that you mentioned. I can't think of the title, but we have interviewed two of those people from the Finnish group, young people.
Operatio Arctis?
Arctis, yes. And that they are more, I would think, representative of the young opinions. Very pro. Am I right?
There very well could be that divide. I know that there's been support from some members of the Sami to Operatio Arctis, and we do find overall that the younger an individual is, the more likely they are to support these technologies. So solar geoengineering, that is a broad one we find in the research, and other studies have found a similar thing.
Well, I'm interested in the whole general question about indigenous people. I keep trying to set up shows with indigenous panelists, but it's really hard to get that to happen. And I had one very prominent Canadian indigenous leader who was on our show several times, and he was trying to organize environmental work in the north of Canada in an area of I've forgotten which Indian native tribes were involved, but he said that he couldn't make any headway with the elders. That, of course, in most communities, the elders have a lot of say-so, and they are of the opinion that you should just sit back and let it happen because this is nature, and you should just not try to interfere. So he says he has a lot of trouble convincing communities because generally the elders oppose. And I haven't been able to get a different, collection of people, so I don't know what the real breakdown is. But I've heard, on the other hand, there are other people who talk about, for example, in Australia, there are some indigenous people living in the area adjacent to the Great Barrier Reef, and that they are extremely enthusiastic about the marine cloud brightening activity going on there, trying to keep the water cool. But again, I want to set up I'd love to have an international a meeting of indigenous people. But I understand that the main guy in the U.S., I did an interview with a guy in Navajo, but he didn't seem to know much. And but the main guy organizing indigenous opinion in the U.S. is very anti geoengineering. But that's what I've been told, and I don't know more than that. I think it's an important question because I do believe, of course, indigenous people or the inhabitants of an area, whatever their ethnic conditions, should certainly be consulted. And yet I'm worried maybe they say,
I think it's always important for these sorts of questions to highlight the excellent work done by others. So when it comes to Indigenous perspectives on justice, Kyle Powys-White in the US has done tremendous work. And I think one of the main points, among many very interesting points that he has made, is a lot of times researchers want to come to a topic such as geoengineering and say, let's only discuss this topic. Researchers or people kind of, proposing these technologies. Whereas he then draws the long story of colonial relationships, including with science, and says, no, we cannot discuss only the technology. We have to discuss it in terms of this, broader history and narrative. And I think it's a very important point, and it's a very fair point as well. So, and I guess this also gets into intersectionality issues around climate change. This idea that we can't talk about other types of justice, whether it's, justice for transitions in employment and other aspects, or feminism and other things, that we have to bring those together when we discuss climate change. But there's a few other things. Then there is some excellent work done by some Brazilian colleagues of mine that also have engaged with shamans in the Amazon. And of course, indigenous peoples are not, in any ways identical or homogenous when it comes to their perspectives on how to engage with the natural world. So, their affinity or willingness to engage with new types of technologies is also important here. So that's another part of the puzzle. And then you mentioned, RRAP, the Reef Restoration Adaptation Program on the Great Barrier Reef. And again, we visited that project and talked to them. Stuart Lockie, who heads up the social engagement research there and has published a lot of important papers. He's at James Cook University. It can't be highlighted enough that we can't speak about the indigenous peoples. I think there's 82 or 83 different traditional landowners who have a claim, whose tribes have a claim on the Great Barrier Reef, that you can't talk about them being positive without acknowledging the amazing work that's gone into actually engaging and talking to these people, not with an agenda, but in a very sort of, proactive and sort of engaging way. So that work needs to be done. And then it could be that people are more willing to talk about these projects or engage with the ideas. But that's not necessarily something that can be taken for granted. If you look at, another marine cloud brightening project in the US, the one that was done by University of Washington and was then shut down, where they were trying to do initially off of Alameda in California, a test. on the USS Hornet, a decommissioned naval carrier, and that got shut down because they did no public engagement.
That's
The
right.
first time that anyone in the local community had heard about it was when there was a big spread in the New York Times. And then 2 weeks ago, a reporter from E&E News had got access to public records and published that apparently behind the scenes, they wanted to have a massive test in Puerto Rico. They were talking to the US government, and they were doing all of these things without one time talking to anyone in the local community.
Was this the Silver Lining Group or who?
So Silver Linings, turns out they were given some support and funding to the project, but the main researchers were at the University of Washington. And I mean, the main point isn't ever really to say, you know, to want to paint a bad brush to the researchers involved. But you just see that there's different, you know, trajectories that the projects take depending on how willing they are to engage with publics versus whether, I think there's no better way to say it, whether they're afraid of talking to publics because it might, you know, be seen to negatively affect the research in one way or another.
You mentioned shamans in South America, but you didn't say what their role is or their attitude.
Yeah. So what the Brazilian colleague, what his research finds is that they're more positive. They're more willing to engage it. And when you talk to them, they say, we intervene in technology in all sorts of ways. It's better to specifically look up his research, and I'll come back to the name here in a second because I'm blanking on it right now. But yeah, you know, this is going to be a complete, unsophisticated approach of what's very interesting research. But you know, when you do certain things, certain practices or dances to get a desired outcome from the weather or rain, this can be seen in some ways as an intervention. It's a very different type of intervention qualitatively, but at the same time, it can speak to a set of beliefs about, you know, how we engage with nature rather than leaving it alone.
I'm not sure what kinds of geoengineering technologies you were mentioning. Did you cover iron fertilization of the oceans, for example, or iron? The attempt to spray iron into the air to neutralize methane. Those are two technologies that I think may not be as well known, but may have a lot more promise than some of the, or at least I'd be more open to them than some of the others.
So interestingly enough, we decided not to cover ocean iron fertilization. The reasoning was when we designed the study, 2022, 2023, this seemed like a dead end. That because of the previous controversy, it wasn't, you know, really discussed much anymore.
We should
it
say
is now
what the controversy was, which was that it had been attempted several years ago under the auspices of a Canadian indigenous tribe in the West Coast. And it worked, but the government intervened and prohibited it. So it got a black eye. At least that's my shorthand synopsis of what happened. Maybe you have a different view of what that amounted to.
The Haida Gwaii the trial with Russ George. Of course, the salmon stocks were boosted, which people have pointed to as evidence that it did in fact work. I've heard some people argue, I don't know the exact arguments well enough to take a side, but that would have happened irrespective, that you can't specifically put it down to the trials. But, you know, it is something to discuss there. I think the bigger issues, and I forget, my former colleague, Sean Lowe, had a good quote here about, you know, rogue cowboy scientists or something, which I guess was a term that was discussed because of the fact that, you know, the comments made that if you give me a ton of carbon, I'll give you an ice age, and these sorts of things that sort of were very evocative, but kind of, you know, inflamed at least scientific consciousness, if not public consciousness. But then, you know, being on the boat that was going in South America, that was, you know, going to do I think LowFX was going to do the trial, that then it getting called back by the German government because there was pressure on the German government that was funding it to desanction the trial. So again, it's one of these examples again about how research can be set back by someone, not engaging with the public and kind of taking things into their own hand, which is why before Make Sunsets, a lot of researchers they were a bit afraid about such an event happening. And then they were immediately, including David Keith, very negative about it being done in this way. Mm-hmm. So we thought OIF, ocean iron fertilization, was kind of a dead end. It's now making a comeback. There are more people talking about it, trying to get funding. It is insanely expensive because of these boats, these research boats. I've been told it takes about $1 million a day to have these boats out on the water. So it's not something that they can do very easily.
But the amount, you only sprinkle is such a minute amount of iron that that we could buy it ourselves. If we take up past the hat, we could cover the expenses. That's interesting that you say it's highly expensive.
It's not the iron that's expensive, it's running the boat. So if you wanted to do a trial to see how it works, having these sort of research expeditions on the boat are just very expensive.
A lot of boats out there in the world anyway. They could just put some on one of these stupid cruise liners.
Yeah, then it gets into the whole how to deploy and other aspects.
Okay, and then I'm changing the subject irrelevantly. I'm sorry.
But then the methane capture is also an interesting one that needs to be looked at a bit more. That was not completely on the radar, and we also wanted to not. We already were worried about overdoing it by asking publics about 3 or even 4 technologies. So, but again, another one that's important for the future.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about this thing of pouring water on top of the ice?
I'm not a geochemist, let alone someone with expertise in Arctic environments. It seemed interesting to me. Having read Mystery for the Future, I've heard some people say it can't work for various reasons. So it's one of these ones that each of these technologies would require so much expertise, and we're talking about 15 to 20 different solutions, so it's hard to kind of take a firm stance. I'd like to see it, explored a bit more, or how it could be deployed in a inexpensive fashion.
But I don't know the outcome of the experiment they were doing in someplace called Cambridge Bay, Canada, and that was a few months project, and I think it may be over, but I'm not sure, and I don't know the results. Anyway, give me your own estimate about where we're going on public opinion here, and can we do anything about it? I mean, if at least I would like to do my part to increase public awareness of the issue and of the various proposed technologies, so that people can talk sensibly and will talk about it, because I think it's certainly time to give it some thought.
It's an important initiative and something that kind of needs to be done. And when we did the Like Diamonds in the Sky study, I thought that at that point there would be enough of a friction or controversy around that it would activate attention, that people would want to speak about it. But for the most part, it's still in the background of their lives. It's not having a direct enough impact. Mm-hmm. The US was the United States participants were the ones who cared the least. So it still hasn't risen to the level of getting their attention. I had said in past discussions that all it takes is someone like Trump or some other politician to come out strongly against it, and then maybe it comes on to it comes into the public eye a bit more. And the problem is, by the time that happens, we then have a very inflamed discussion where you have people taking sides. There's some good researchers in the US that are already seeing some polarization around this. Mm-hmm. The more concerning sign is now that certain representatives in the United States and certain governments, state governments, are trying to ban weather modification, which is a kind of, conspiracy theory and how they're describing it. Mm-hmm. And then lumping in solar geoengineering under this. it's pushing in this direction where more and more of the discussion is going to be co-opted by sort of conspiracy level thinking. A new study just came out that looked at this from some very good focus groups across the United States. So I'm worried that we're kind of caught between the public's not caring enough because it seems too distant versus attracting enough conspiracy thinking that there's going to be this segment of the population maybe a bit below the radar, but increasingly present in online discussions that will, push things in a way that will be hard to, moderate into the future. I would love if there was some sort of funding that would be much less expensive than some of the trials out there, but it's hard to kind of get the funding for having some sort of global deliberation, whether it's citizens' assemblies or deliberative polling, to kind of do this work in a very meaningful way across the world. What we found is engaging some of the countries that hadn't been spoken to a lot about this topic, specifically in the global south, that they were very engaged and very wanting to discuss about this and very happy that they were actually being asked about this. So I think there's an appetite for that, but it takes money, a lot more money that typically goes to social sciences research, and yet a fraction of what goes to the more technical engineering research. So it'd be nice to see someone push that forward in order that we can actually discuss these issues and maybe have a better understanding of, what sort of questions we're ignoring as researchers, or what are some other ways that we should be engaging on this topic.
Well, you happen to mention Citizens Assembly, which is my other big enthusiasm. I spend, many of my waking hours thinking about how to promote citizens' assemblies, which I'm actually going to be doing on a small scale. But also, of course, I'm equally concerned about global warming and now about AI. So all of those things, I'll be doing citizens' assemblies on a small. Well, I shouldn't even call them that because I can't do sortition, but otherwise I'll be running them like citizens' assemblies. And that's too big a topic to get into now. We've overshot our time. But in terms of, may I get some of your tables to print in the magazine when we publish the October issue? Because it would be good to be able to show some of the key, say the marginals for some of your variables in the October issue, and I'm very, very likely to make a transcript of this and edit it a little bit and then publish it in the magazine, if that's all right with you.
Sure. Yeah. If there's any specific tables you want, I can pull those up.
This has been absolutely wonderful, and I really am glad you're doing the work. It's very, very important, immensely important. So thank you so much. And I expect that we'll be back in touch further about your work and about what we have to do to save the world. Okay?
Perfect. Let me know. And also, if you have questions specifically about the focus groups, I can route those to Livia that she can give her say as well.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Have a great day.
Bye.